Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. The Winter Gala Invitation. The frost had come early to Much Benham that January, settling like powdered sugar across the lawns of Gosington Hall and turning the bare branches of the ancient oaks into crystalline sculptures against the pewter sky. Mrs. Dolly Bantry stood at the tall windows of the morning room, her breath misting the glass as she surveyed the preparations taking place in the courtyard below. Servants hurried back and forth with armfuls of hothouse flowers, their cheeks ruddy from the bitter wind that promised snow before nightfall. "Arthur, do you suppose people will actually venture out in this weather?" she asked, turning to where her husband sat behind his morning paper, a picture of comfortable domesticity in his leather armchair by the fire. Colonel Bantry lowered the Times with the measured deliberation of a man who had learned patience through years of military service. His kind eyes, still sharp despite his 60-odd years, took in his wife's anxious expression with familiar fondness. "My dear Dolly, you've been fretting about this charity ball for weeks. The roads are still passable, and you know perfectly well that nothing short of a blizzard would keep the county from attending one of your gatherings. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "it's for the children's hospital. People will come." Dolly Bantry was not entirely convinced. She'd thrown herself into organising this winter gala with characteristic enthusiasm, transforming Gosington Hall into what she privately considered a fairy tale setting. The great hall blazed with banks of white chrysanthemums and trailing ivy, while hundreds of candles flickered in the crystal chandeliers her grandmother had brought from Vienna. The conservatory had been converted into a magical winter garden. Its glass walls steamed with warmth while tropical orchids bloomed in exotic profusion among carefully arranged palms and ferns. "Mrs. Bantry, ma'am," came a voice from the doorway. Mrs. Beddoes, the housekeeper, appeared with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to the household for nearly 20 years. "The flowers for the dining room have arrived, and Cook wants to know about the timing for the salmon." "Oh yes, the salmon." Dolly pressed her fingers to her temples. "Tell Cook we'll serve dinner at 9 sharp, but the champagne reception begins at 7. And Mrs. Beddoes, do make certain the fires are built up properly. I won't have our guests catching pneumonia." "Very good, ma'am. And shall I have James check the conservatory heating again? With this cold snap, we can't be too careful about the orchids." Dolly nodded absently, her mind already racing ahead to the dozen other details that required her attention. The guest list for tonight's affair represented the cream of county society, each invitation carefully considered and personally written in her elegant script. There would be Dr. Fenton, the retired physician whose passion for orchid cultivation was matched only by his reputation for eccentricity. His collection was said to be one of the finest in England, though his methods of acquiring rare specimens were rumoured to be somewhat unorthodox. Then there was Hugh Salt, the rising Member of Parliament whose boyish charm and progressive politics had made him something of a local celebrity. At 35, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the county, though Dolly suspected his interests were more firmly fixed on advancement than matrimony. Her cousin Veronica would be attending, of course. Veronica Denham had been widowed 3 years earlier, when her husband's yacht had capsized off the coast of Monte Carlo, leaving her a woman of considerable means and striking beauty. At 42, Veronica possessed the kind of sophisticated elegance that Dolly rather envied, with her sleek dark hair and the sort of clothes that could only come from the finest London dressmakers. "I do hope Veronica hasn't changed her mind about staying the night," Dolly murmured to herself. This weather would make the drive back to London quite treacherous. She had also invited Elsie Ridge, Hugh Salt's secretary, partly from kindness and partly because the young woman's shy devotion to her employer had touched Dolly's romantic heart. Poor Elsie, with her nervous manner and unfashionable spectacles, seemed unlikely to capture the attention of someone like Hugh Salt, but Dolly lived in hope that proximity might work its magic. Major Hale would be there as well, Arthur's old regimental friend whose booming voice and tendency to relive past military campaigns could be counted upon to fill any awkward silences in the conversation. The Major had never married, preferring the company of his fellow officers and his extensive collection of military memorabilia. By 6 o'clock, as the first flakes of snow began to drift past the windows, Dolly had changed into her best burgundy velvet gown and supervised the final arrangements. The house glowed with warmth and welcome, every surface polished to perfection, every flower arranged just so. James, the butler, had positioned himself by the front door with military precision, while the temporary staff hired for the evening waited in the servants' hall for their instructions. The guests began arriving shortly after 7, their motors crunching through the light dusting of snow that had already begun to accumulate on the drive. Dr. Fenton was first, a tall, angular man with wild white hair who immediately made his way to the conservatory to examine the orchid display with professional interest. "Remarkable specimens, Mrs. Bantry," he announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he peered at a particularly exotic bloom. "Though I must say, some of these varieties are quite rare. I do hope your supplier was reputable." Hugh Salt arrived with Elsie Ridge, the young woman trailing behind him like a shadow as he worked the room with practised political charm. Dolly noticed how Elsie's eyes never left his face, even as she remained silent in the background, occasionally consulted about some detail of his schedule or correspondence. Major Hale bounded in with characteristic vigour, immediately commanding attention with his opinions on the weather, the roads, and the general state of the world. Veronica was the last to arrive, sweeping in with elegant composure despite the increasingly heavy snowfall outside. "Darling Dolly," she murmured, embracing her cousin with air kisses that managed to avoid disturbing either woman's carefully arranged hair. "What a perfectly enchanting evening you've created. Though I must confess I'm rather concerned about the weather. My driver seemed quite worried about the return journey." "Nonsense," Dolly replied firmly. "You must stay the night. I've already had Mrs. Beddoes prepare the blue room for you just in case." As the evening progressed, Dolly felt her earlier anxieties melting away like the snowflakes against the warm windows. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the champagne. The dinner was pronounced a triumph, and even the most critical members of county society seemed charmed by the magical atmosphere she had created. It was just past 10 o'clock when she stepped outside onto the terrace for a breath of fresh air, leaving her guests to their port and cigars in the library. The snow was falling more heavily now, transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and beautiful. She was about to return inside when a movement near the conservatory caught her eye. A figure stood in the shadows beyond the glass walls, barely visible through the swirling snow. For a moment, Dolly felt a flutter of unease, but then common sense reasserted itself. Doubtless it was one of the hired staff taking a moment's respite from the evening's duties. She made a mental note to remind Mrs. Beddoes that the servants should use the proper entrances, then hurried back inside to rejoin her guests. If she'd lingered a moment longer, she might have noticed that the mysterious figure was not dressed as a servant, and that his attention seemed focused with unusual intensity on the exotic blooms within the heated glass walls of her prized conservatory. Chapter 2. A Corpse in the Conservatory. The lights in the great hall flickered once, twice, then steadied with the determined glow of electricity fighting against the storm outside. Dolly Bantry, who had been circulating among her guests with the practised ease of an experienced hostess, paused mid-sentence in her conversation with Dr. Fenton about the merits of various fertilizers for exotic plants. "Oh dear," she murmured, glancing toward the ornate chandelier above them. "I do hope the power holds. James did warn me that the lines might be affected by the weight of the snow." "Nothing to worry about, my dear," Colonel Bantry called from his position near the fireplace, where he had been regaling Major Hale with stories of their shared service in India. The generator is in perfect working order. Had it serviced just last month. Hugh Salt, who had been deep in conversation with Veronica Denham about some matter of political interest, looked up with the alert expression of a man accustomed to contingencies. Perhaps we should check on the telephone lines as well. With this weather, communication might become an issue. Elsie Ridge, hovering as always in the background of her employer's conversations, made a small notation in the leather-bound diary she carried everywhere. "Shall I make a note to have the lines checked first thing tomorrow morning, Mr. Salt?" "An excellent idea, Miss Ridge, though I suspect by tomorrow morning we may all be well and truly snowed in." Dr. Fenton adjusted his spectacles and peered toward the windows, where the snow was now falling in earnest, thick flakes that seemed to absorb all sound from the outside world. "Remarkable how quickly it's accumulating. I do hope my orchids in the conservatory are maintaining proper temperature. Some of the more delicate specimens are quite sensitive to fluctuations." "I'm sure they're perfectly safe," Dolly assured him, though she made a mental note to have James check the heating system again. The conservatory has always been the warmest room in the house. It was then that the lights flickered again, more dramatically this time, plunging the room into near darkness for several long seconds, before the electric illumination returned with renewed strength. In the brief moment of darkness, Dolly thought she heard a sound from the direction of the conservatory, a sharp crack, like glass breaking, or perhaps a branch snapping under the weight of snow. "I say," Major Hale declared with military brusqueness, "that didn't sound quite right. Shall we investigate?" Colonel Bantry was already moving toward the door that led to the conservatory, his years of service having taught him to respond quickly to unusual circumstances. "James," he called to the butler, who had appeared with characteristic promptness, "bring a torch, will you? Just in case the lights decide to play up again." The small party made their way through the connecting corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that ran the length of the passage. The conservatory door stood slightly ajar, which struck Dolly as odd since she distinctly remembered closing it earlier to preserve the carefully maintained temperature within. Colonel Bantry pushed the door open wider, and immediately the warm, humid air of the conservatory enveloped them, heavy with the scent of exotic blooms and rich earth. The heating system hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the tropical atmosphere that allowed Dr. Fenton's precious orchids to flourish even in the depths of an English winter. It was Veronica who saw him first. "Good heavens," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arthur, there's someone there." Among the lush foliage of the conservatory, partially hidden by the broad leaves of a banana plant, lay the still form of a man. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, now damp with condensation from the humid air, and his face was turned away from them, toward the glass wall that looked out onto the snow-covered garden. Colonel Bantry stepped forward with the measured tread of a man who'd seen death before, in various forms and circumstances. He knelt beside the prone figure and gently turned the man's head to examine his face. "Dead," he said simply. "Has been for some time, I should think." Dr. Fenton, his medical training overriding his shock, moved to Colonel Bantry's side and made his own examination. "No obvious wounds," he reported, his voice taking on the professional detachment of a physician. "Though there's an odd discoloration around the lips, rather bluish tinge." Hugh Salt had remained by the door, his political instincts warning him against becoming too closely involved in what was clearly going to become a matter for the authorities. "Do we know who he is?" Colonel Bantry began a careful search of the man's pockets, while Dr. Fenton continued his examination. The overcoat was of good quality but unremarkable, the sort that might be purchased at any respectable outfitter. The man's shoes were well polished but showed signs of recent walking through wet ground. "No identification," Colonel Bantry reported after a thorough search. "No wallet, no calling cards, nothing with a name on it." He paused, withdrawing a small leather-bound diary from an inner pocket. "Wait, there's this." The diary was cheaply made, the sort sold at any stationer's, but its pages were mostly blank. Only one entry caught their attention, tomorrow's date, circled in red ink with no accompanying notation. "Tomorrow?" Dolly repeated, peering over her husband's shoulder. "But what could that mean?" Perhaps he had an appointment, Elsie Ridge suggested quietly, though it seems rather ominous now, doesn't it? Major Hale, who had been maintaining a watch at the door, cleared his throat importantly. Shouldn't we telephone the police? This is clearly a matter for the authorities. Colonel Bantry rose from his examination of the body and dusted off his knees. Quite right, Major. Though I suspect the telephone lines may be down by now, this storm is getting quite severe. As if summoned by his words, James appeared in the doorway with a grave expression. Begging your pardon, sir, but I've just attempted to telephone the village, and the lines appear to be down. The storm, I'm afraid, has brought down several trees across the road as well. I took the liberty of sending young Tom to investigate, and he reports that we're quite cut off until the morning at the earliest. A silence fell over the group as the implications of this news sank in. They were trapped at Gosington Hall with a dead stranger, and no means of summoning help until the storm passed and the roads could be cleared. Well, Dolly said, with the sort of determined cheerfulness that had seen her through countless social crises, I suppose we must make the best of it. James, please see that the conservatory is locked, and that no one disturbs anything until the proper authorities can be summoned. Very good, madam. And shall I inform the other staff? Yes, but discreetly. I don't want to cause panic among the servants. Dr. Fenton was still examining the body with professional interest. Most curious, he murmured. The discoloration I mentioned, it's quite distinctive. Not the sort of thing one sees in natural death. Are you suggesting, Hugh Salt asked with evident concern, that this man might have been murdered? I'm suggesting, Dr. Fenton replied carefully, that the circumstances of his death bear investigation. The blue tinge around the lips, the way he's positioned, it's all rather unusual. Veronica, who had been remarkably composed throughout the discovery, moved closer to examine the orchids near where the body lay. Some of these plants have been disturbed, she observed. See how the soil is scattered, and this bloom here has been broken. Colonel Bantry nodded grimly. James, I want you to post someone at the conservatory door. No one is to enter until we can contact the police. But Arthur, Dolly protested, what about our guests? We can't simply pretend nothing has happened. We'll have to tell them something, he agreed, though perhaps not the full details just yet. No point in causing unnecessary alarm. As they prepared to leave the conservatory, each lost in their own thoughts about the mysterious stranger and the implications of his presence at Gosington Hall, none of them noticed the small detail that would later prove significant. A few grains of what appeared to be blue-tinged powder scattered among the disturbed soil near the exotic orchids, almost invisible against the rich, dark earth. The snow continued to fall outside the glass walls, sealing them in with their unwelcome discovery, and the growing certainty that before morning they would need to determine not only who the dead man was, but why he had come to Gosington Hall on this particular night, and what his presence meant for all of them. Chapter 3, Miss Marple Hears a Whisper. The telephone call came to Miss Jane Marple at precisely 11 o'clock that evening, just as she was settling down with her knitting and a cup of cocoa before the sitting-room fire. The wind had been rattling the windows of her cottage in St. Mary Mead for the past hour, and she had been reflecting on how fortunate she was to be warm and comfortable indoors on such a dreadful night. "Oh, Jane, thank heavens you're there," came Dolly Bantry's voice across the crackling connection, pitched higher than usual with barely controlled anxiety. "I'm in the most terrible predicament, and I simply don't know what to do." Miss Marple set down her knitting and gave her full attention to her friend's distressed tone. She had known Dolly Bantry for the better part of 20 years, ever since they had served together on the committee for the village flower show, and she could count on the fingers of one hand the occasions when she had heard such genuine distress in that familiar voice. "My dear Dolly, whatever is the matter? You sound quite overwrought." "There's been an incident at the hall," Dolly continued, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "A man, a complete stranger. He's been found dead in our conservatory. During my charity ball, Jane. Can you imagine anything more dreadful?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Dead, you say? How very unfortunate. Have you contacted the police?" "That's just it. We can't. The telephone lines are down everywhere except for this one connection to the village, and the roads are completely impassable. We're all trapped here until morning at the earliest, and I simply don't know how to manage the situation. Arthur is being wonderfully calm, of course, but the guests are beginning to ask questions, and I'm afraid the whole thing will become a dreadful scandal." Miss Marple considered this information with the methodical thoroughness that had served her well in previous encounters with mysterious circumstances. "Tell me about this stranger, Dolly. Had anyone seen him before tonight?" "That's the peculiar thing. No one seems to know who he is. He had no identification, nothing except a diary with tomorrow's date circled. Dr. Fenton thinks there might be something suspicious about the way he died, though he hasn't said so directly." "Dr. Fenton is a sensible man," Miss Marple observed. "If he has concerns, they should be taken seriously. Now, Dolly, I want you to listen carefully. Make certain that nothing in the conservatory is disturbed, and try to keep track of where everyone was when the body was discovered. Details that seem unimportant now may prove significant later. Oh, Jane, I do wish you were here. You have such a practical way of looking at things." Miss Marple glanced toward the window where the snow was now falling so thickly that the street lamp at the corner was barely visible through the white curtain. "The last train leaves in 20 minutes, she said decisively. "If I hurry, I might just catch it before the line is blocked entirely. But Jane, in this weather—" "Nonsense. A little snow never hurt anyone, and you clearly need a friend. I shall be there as soon as humanly possible." Within 15 minutes, Miss Marple had packed a small overnight bag, left detailed instructions for her daily help about the care of her plants and the cat, and was making her way through the deepening snow toward the railway station. The village was eerily quiet, with most sensible people safely indoors, but she encountered Mrs. Wheeling from the post office struggling with her umbrella near the church. "Dreadful night, Miss Marple," Mrs. Wheeling called out. "Hardly fit for man nor beast. Wherever are you going in such weather?" "To visit a friend in need," Miss Marple replied, reflecting that this was certainly true, if not entirely complete. "Do take care not to slip, Mrs. Wheeling." The railway station was nearly deserted, with only a handful of hardy souls determined to travel despite the storm. Miss Marple purchased her ticket and settled into a corner seat of the carriage, grateful for the warmth and the opportunity to consider what little she knew about the situation at Gosington Hall. It was then that she became aware of the conversation taking place in the seats behind her. Two elderly sisters, evidently returning from a visit to London, were discussing the day's adventures in the sort of penetrating whispers that are somehow more audible than normal conversation. "I still can't quite believe what that man at Harrods told us about the orchids, Millicent," one of them was saying. "Fancy that! Black market orchids! Who would have thought such a thing existed?" "Quite shocking, Dorothea. Though I suppose people will buy and sell anything if there's money to be made. He said some of the rare varieties change hands for hundreds of pounds. And apparently not all of the dealing is entirely legal. Something about import restrictions and forged certificates. I'm sure I didn't understand half of it, but it did sound rather sordid. Well, I shall never look at the orchid display at the Chelsea Flower Show in quite the same way again. To think that some of those beautiful flowers might have been obtained through criminal means." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the same careful attention she might have given to an important clue in one of her nephew's detective novels. The coincidence of overhearing a discussion about orchid smuggling on the very evening when a mysterious stranger died among Dr. Fenton's prized orchid collection was too significant to ignore. The train journey seemed to take forever, with frequent stops and delays as the locomotive struggled through the mounting snow. Miss Marple used the time to organise her thoughts and consider the various possibilities that might explain the evening's events. By the time the train finally wheezed to a halt at Much Benham Station, she had formed several preliminary theories, none of them particularly comforting. The station master, a cheerful man despite the late hour and difficult conditions, arranged for her to share a taxi with 2 other passengers making the journey to Gosington Hall. The driver, a local man who knew every lane and byway in the district, managed to navigate the treacherous roads with skill and determination, though the journey that normally took 15 minutes stretched to nearly an hour. "Lucky you're going to the hall tonight, miss," the driver commented as they turned into the long drive leading to the house. "Don't reckon anyone will be leaving there until this weather clears. Proper snowed in, they'll be—" Gosington Hall loomed before them through the swirling snow, its windows glowing warmly against the winter darkness. Miss Marple could see figures moving about inside, and she noticed that several of the ground floor rooms were still brightly lit despite the late hour. Clearly the household had not yet settled down for the night. James the butler opened the front door before she had even reached the steps, his professional composure intact despite what must have been a most trying evening. "Miss Marple, ma'am, Mrs. Bantry's expecting you in the morning room." Miss Marple handed over her coat and overnight bag, noting the subtle signs of strain in the usually impeccable household routine. Voices could be heard from the library, where the guests were presumably still discussing the evening's shocking discovery, and she caught a glimpse of a uniformed constable standing guard outside what she assumed must be the conservatory door. Dolly Bantry rose to greet her with evident relief, embracing her friend with unusual warmth. "Jane, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you've come. The whole situation has become quite impossible." "Now then, Dolly, let's have no more of that talk," Miss Marple said briskly, settling into a comfortable chair and accepting the cup of tea that appeared as if by magic. "Tell me exactly what has happened, and don't leave out any details, no matter how trivial they might seem." As Dolly recounted the events of the evening, Miss Marple listened with the concentrated attention of someone accustomed to finding significance in the smallest details. When the account was finished, she sat quietly for a moment, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "Most interesting," she said finally. "And you say this stranger was seen loitering near the conservatory earlier in the evening?" "Yes, though I thought nothing of it at the time. I assumed he was one of the hired staff." "A natural assumption. Now I should very much like to meet your guests and observe them for myself. In my experience, people often reveal more than they intend when they believe themselves to be unobserved. Of course, they're all still in the library, though I must warn you, everyone is rather on edge. The circumstances are so very peculiar." Miss Marple smiled her gentle, reassuring smile. "My dear Dolly, peculiar circumstances are often the most revealing. Shall we join your guests? I find that a fresh pair of eyes can sometimes see things that others have missed." As they made their way toward the library, Miss Marple reflected on the curious information she had overheard about black market orchids. Combined with the mysterious stranger's presence in the conservatory and the circled date in his diary, she was beginning to form a picture of events that was far more complex than a simple case of natural death during a snowstorm. Chapter 4. Footprints across the frosted lawn. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Gosington Hall, the storm having spent its fury during the night but leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow lay deep across the grounds, turning familiar paths into treacherous channels, and bending the branches of ancient trees into fantastic shapes under their burden of white. Miss Marple, who had risen early despite the late hour of her arrival, stood at her bedroom window observing the scene with the methodical attention she brought to all matters of interest. The previous evening's introductions to the assembled guests had been illuminating in their own way. She had noted the careful politeness with which they treated each other, the sort of formal courtesy that often masks deeper currents of emotion. Dr. Fenton had been particularly eager to discuss his orchid collection, though he had seemed oddly defensive when the conversation touched on the methods by which rare specimens were acquired. Hugh Salt had demonstrated the practised charm of a politician, while his secretary, Miss Ridge, had remained virtually silent in the background, her nervous energy almost palpable. Veronica Denham had impressed Miss Marple as a woman of considerable self-possession, perhaps too much so for someone who had just discovered a corpse at a social gathering. Major Hale had blustered about the inconvenience of being trapped by the weather, but Miss Marple had detected genuine concern beneath his military bluster. Now, in the clear light of morning, she was eager to examine the physical evidence that the scene might provide. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and made her way downstairs, where she found Colonel Bantry in the breakfast room, studying a cup of coffee with the grim concentration of a man facing an unpleasant duty. "Good morning, Colonel," she said quietly. "I trust you managed some sleep despite the circumstances." Arthur Bantry looked up with evident relief at seeing a familiar and sensible face. "Miss Marple, thank goodness. I've been wondering how to proceed. The telephone is still out, and I'm afraid we won't be able to contact the authorities until the roads are cleared." "Perhaps that's not entirely unfortunate," Miss Marple observed, accepting a cup of tea from James, who appeared with his usual silent efficiency. "It gives us an opportunity to observe things as they are before official procedures disturb the evidence." "Evidence?" Colonel Bantry raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more to this than meets the eye?" "In my experience, Colonel, when mysterious strangers appear at country houses during snowstorms and turn up dead in conservatories, there's almost always more to the story than appears on the surface." At that moment, Dr. Fenton appeared in the doorway, already dressed for outdoors in a heavy overcoat and sturdy boots. "Ah, Colonel Bantry, I was hoping to have a look at the grounds this morning. The snow may have covered important evidence, but there might still be traces of how our uninvited guest arrived." Miss Marple set down a teacup with quiet determination. "An excellent idea, Dr. Fenton. I should very much like to join you if I may. Fresh air and observation often clarify the mind wonderfully." The search party that assembled in the entrance hall 20 minutes later consisted of Colonel Bantry, Dr. Fenton, Major Hale, and Miss Marple, with James providing additional lanterns and the services of young Tom, the gardener's boy, who knew every inch of the grounds. Hugh Salt had begged off, claiming pressing correspondence, while the ladies had sensibly remained indoors in the warmth. The cold struck them immediately as they stepped outside, a sharp, clean cold that made their breath visible in white puffs. The snow crunched underfoot with the particular sound that speaks of several inches of accumulation, and Miss Marple was grateful for the sturdy boots she had had the foresight to pack. "Now then," Colonel Bantry said, taking charge with military efficiency, "let's examine the perimeter systematically. If this fellow came from outside, there should be some trace of his approach." They began at the main entrance, where the drive curved in a graceful sweep before the front of the house. Here, the snow was churned and disturbed by the passage of motor cars and the feet of arriving guests, making any individual trail impossible to distinguish. "Nothing here," Major Hale observed, stating the obvious with characteristic bluntness. "Too much traffic. We'll need to look elsewhere." They moved methodically around the house, examining each possible approach. The formal gardens to the east showed no signs of disturbance, their neat beds and carefully trimmed hedges presenting an unbroken expanse of white. The kitchen garden and servants' entrance revealed only the expected tracks of household staff going about their morning duties. It was Tom who made the first significant discovery, near the side gate that led from the grounds to the lane running past the estate. "Here, sir," he called, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Someone's been through this way, and not so long ago neither." The tracks were clear and unmistakable in the undisturbed snow beyond the gate, the impression of a man's boots, size 10 or 11, leading directly from the lane toward the house. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the trail, ignoring the cold that immediately began to seep through her skirts. "Interesting," she murmured, studying the depth and clarity of the impressions. These were made after the heavier snow stopped falling, but before it had a chance to drift and fill them in. Dr. Fenton, who had been following the trail with professional interest, suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Look there, the tracks lead directly to the conservatory." Indeed, the single line of footprints proceeded across the lawn in an almost straight line, skirting the formal garden and leading directly to the glass structure where the body had been found. But as they followed the trail to its end, Miss Marple noticed something that made her frown thoughtfully. "How very curious," she said, examining the ground near the conservatory door. "The tracks end here, but there are no returning footprints." Colonel Bantry studied the evidence with growing puzzlement. "But that's impossible. If the fellow walked here from the gate, he must have left some trace of his departure." "Unless," Major Hale suggested grimly, "he never left at all." Miss Marple continued her careful examination of the area, noting every detail with the thoroughness that had served her well in previous investigations. It was then that she noticed something that the others had missed: a wheelbarrow, partially concealed behind a garden shed, with one wheel distinctly damaged. "Tom," she called to the gardener's boy, "is this wheelbarrow normally kept here?" The lad shook his head emphatically. "No, miss. Should be in the tool shed, it should, and that wheel's been broken for weeks. Can't use it proper like." Miss Marple examined the wheelbarrow more closely, noting the fresh scratches on its metal surface and the way it had been positioned behind the shed. "Most illuminating," she murmured. "Colonel Bantry, I believe this wheelbarrow may explain our missing footprints." "How so, Miss Marple?" "Consider the evidence. Our mysterious visitor approaches the conservatory on foot, leaving clear tracks in the snow, but there are no departing footprints. However, if someone were to place his body in this wheelbarrow and push it backward, following the original trail, the wheel would obliterate the footprints, while the person pushing walked in the already disturbed snow." Dr. Fenton nodded slowly. "Ingenious. But that would mean the body was moved after death, which suggests—" "Murder," Colonel Bantry finished grimly. "Someone killed him, then attempted to create the impression that he had approached the conservatory but never left." Major Hale, who had been studying the damaged wheelbarrow, looked up with interest. "Clever bit of staging, if you ask me. Military mind at work, perhaps. Someone who understands the importance of covering tracks." Miss Marple rose from her examination of the evidence, brushing snow from her skirts with practical efficiency. "What troubles me most," she said thoughtfully, "is the planning involved. This was not a crime of passion, but something carefully orchestrated. Someone knew that Stranger would be coming to the conservatory last night." "But how could anyone have known that?" Colonel Bantry asked. "We didn't even know who he was." "Ah," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "But perhaps someone did know who he was and why he was coming. The question is, which of your guests had reason to expect an uninvited visitor? And more importantly, which of them had reason to want that visitor permanently silenced?" As they made their way back to the house, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern, though many pieces of the puzzle remained maddeningly unclear. The wheelbarrow trick demonstrated cunning and forethought, while the visitor's approach suggested he had come to the conservatory for a specific purpose. The circled date in his diary now took on new significance. Had he arranged to meet someone at Gosington Hall? And if so, had that meeting gone tragically wrong? Or had it proceeded exactly as someone had planned? One thing was certain. Among the guests trapped at Gosington Hall by the storm was someone who had committed murder, and who might well be prepared to kill again to protect their secret. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Servants' Wing. Upon their return from the morning's expedition, Miss Marple excused herself from the breakfast table, with a gentle suggestion that she would like to speak with the household staff. Colonel Bantry, understanding her methods from long acquaintance with her reputation for solving delicate matters, readily gave his consent. "Quite right, Miss Marple," he agreed. "Servants see everything, though they don't always realise the significance of what they've observed." "Precisely, Colonel. In my experience, the domestic staff often possess the most complete picture of events, simply because they move through the house at all hours and in all circumstances." Miss Marple made her way through the green baize door that separated the family quarters from the servants' domain, a world that operated according to its own strict hierarchies and traditions. The contrast was immediate. Where the main house spoke of comfort and leisure, the servants' hall buzzed with purposeful activity despite the unusual circumstances that had disrupted the household routine. Mrs. Beddoes, the housekeeper, presided over the morning's activities with the calm authority that had made her indispensable to the Bantry family for 2 decades. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with greying hair pulled back in a severe but neat style, and the sort of competent bearing that suggested she could manage any domestic crisis with equal measures of common sense and determination. "Miss Marple," she said with respectful recognition, "Mrs. Bantry mentioned you might wish to speak with us. Such a dreadful business, and on the night of the charity ball too. 20 years I've been in service here, and nothing like this has ever happened." "I'm sure it must be very distressing for everyone," Miss Marple replied with genuine sympathy. Perhaps we might speak privately. I understand from Colonel Bantry that you've been most helpful in managing the situation." Mrs. Beddoes led her to the housekeeper's sitting room, a comfortable space that reflected its occupant's orderly nature. Ledgers and household accounts were neatly arranged on the desk, and a small fire burned cheerfully in the grate. "Now then," Miss Marple began, settling into the chair Mrs. Beddoes offered, "I wonder if you might tell me about any unusual occurrences yesterday. Anything that struck you as out of the ordinary, no matter how trivial it might seem." The housekeeper considered this carefully. "Well, there was the matter of the stranger asking about Mrs. Denham's brooch." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "A stranger asked about Mrs. Denham's brooch? When was this?" "Yesterday afternoon, when I was checking the conservatory heating as Mrs. Bantry had requested. I found him there among the orchids. Gave me quite a start, I can tell you. He was well dressed, polite enough, but he shouldn't have been in the house at all. And he specifically mentioned Mrs. Denham's brooch. Indeed he did. Asked if I knew anything about a blue cameo brooch that Mrs. Denham might be wearing to the evening's festivities. Said he was interested in antique jewellery. I told him quite firmly that it was not my place to discuss the family's possessions with strangers." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Mrs. Beddoes. How did he react to your refusal to discuss the matter?" "He was apologetic, said he hadn't meant to cause offence. But there was something about the way he kept looking at those orchids, as if he was searching for something specific. Most interesting. Did you see him again after this encounter?" "No, miss. I assumed he'd left the grounds, though, now that I think about it, I never actually saw him leave." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. "You mentioned Mrs. Denham's brooch specifically. Is it a notable piece?" "Oh, yes, quite distinctive. A blue cameo set in gold. Rather old-fashioned, but quite beautiful. She wore it to dinner last night. I noticed it particularly because it matched her gown so well." At that moment there was a soft knock at the door, and a young kitchen maid appeared with a tea tray. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with the sort of nervous energy that suggested she was relatively new to her position. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Beddoes," the girl said, setting down the tray with careful precision. "Cook sent this up. Thought you might be wanting refreshment." "Thank you, Mary. Miss Marple, this is Mary Fletcher, one of our kitchen maids." Miss Marple studied the young woman with the benevolent interest she brought to all her observations of human nature. "How do you do, Mary? I wonder, did you happen to notice Mrs. Denham's brooch last evening?" Mary's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone being asked about something that had genuinely impressed her. "Oh, yes, miss. Beautiful it was. Like something from a museum. All blue and white with tiny pearls around the edge. Must be worth ever so much." "You have a good eye for detail, Mary. Did you notice if Mrs. Denham wore it throughout the entire evening?" The kitchen maid considered this carefully. "Well, she had it on at dinner, I'm certain of that. I was helping to serve, and I couldn't help but admire it. But later, when I was clearing away the coffee things from the library," she paused, looking uncertain. "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "Well, I thought I saw her adjusting it, like it might have come loose or something. She seemed quite concerned about it." Mrs. Beddoes frowned. "When was this, Mary?" "Just before the lights flickered, I think. Maybe around 10 o'clock. She was standing near the library window and she kept touching the brooch, as if she was making sure it was secure." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest. The timeline was becoming clearer. The stranger had asked about the brooch in the afternoon. Mrs. Denham had worn it to dinner, and she had been seen adjusting it shortly before the lights flickered and the body was discovered. "Mrs. Beddoes," she said thoughtfully, "has Mrs. Denham stayed at Gosington Hall before?" "Oh yes, many times. She's Mrs. Bantry's cousin, you know. Always welcome here, and always very gracious to the staff. And this brooch, have you seen her wear it on previous visits?" The housekeeper paused, considering. "Now that you mention it, no. I don't recall seeing it before last night. But then, Mrs. Denham has many fine pieces of jewellery." Mary, who had been listening with obvious interest, cleared her throat diffidently. "If I may say so, miss, Mrs. Denham seemed quite particular about that brooch last night. Not like her usual jewellery at all. In what way, Mary? Well, she's normally very casual about her things, if you know what I mean. Expensive, but she doesn't fuss over them. But with that brooch, she kept checking on it, making sure it was positioned just so. Miss Marple filed this observation away with the growing collection of details that were beginning to form a pattern. One more question, if I may. Did either of you notice anything unusual about the conservatory yesterday, apart from the stranger's presence? Mrs. Beddoes shook her head, but Mary looked thoughtful. There was something, actually. When I was taking scraps to the compost heap yesterday evening, I noticed one of Dr. Fenton's orchids had been cut. Not damaged, cut clean, like someone had taken a bloom with proper scissors. Which orchid was this, Mary? One of the blue ones, miss. Pretty little thing with petals like velvet. Dr. Fenton was ever so particular about those blue ones, said they were his pride and joy. Miss Marple rose from her chair with a satisfied air of someone who had learned exactly what she had hoped to discover. Thank you both. You've been most helpful. As she made her way back through the green baize door to the main house, Miss Marple reflected on the information she'd gathered. The mysterious stranger's interest in Veronica Denham's blue cameo brooch, combined with Mary's observation about the cut blue orchid, suggested connections that were far from coincidental. Someone had wanted that brooch badly enough to risk infiltrating a private gathering during a snowstorm. The question now was whether Veronica Denham had been an innocent victim of the stranger's interest, or whether she had been expecting his visit all along. The blue theme that seemed to run through all the evidence, the discoloration around the dead man's lips, the blue cameo brooch, the blue orchid, was beginning to form a pattern that Miss Marple found both fascinating and deeply troubling. Chapter 6, Colonel Bantry's Vanishing Ledger. Miss Marple found Colonel Bantry in his study, a masculine sanctuary lined with military memorabilia and leather-bound volumes that spoke of a lifetime spent in service to Crown and country. He was standing before an oak cabinet, its doors thrown open to reveal neat rows of ledgers and account books, but his expression was one of considerable perplexity. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, turning as she entered. "Perfect timing. I seem to have encountered a most puzzling situation." "Indeed, Colonel? What sort of situation?" Arthur Bantry gestured toward the open cabinet with evident frustration. "One of my wartime ledgers has gone missing. I keep them all here, you see, arranged chronologically. Each one represents a year of service, but one volume is simply not where it should be." Miss Marple approached the cabinet and examined the neat arrangement of books. "Which year is missing, Colonel?" 1943, a particularly significant year as it happens. That ledger contained records of certain delicate financial arrangements made during my intelligence work in North Africa. The careful way he chose his words told Miss Marple that she was hearing about matters that had once been classified at the highest levels. "What sort of arrangements, if you don't mind my asking?" Colonel Bantry moved to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "Payments to local informants, Miss Marple. Men and women who risk their lives to provide information about enemy movements. We used code names, of course, but that ledger contained the real identities behind those codes, along with records of compensation promised but not always delivered due to the exigencies of war." "How many people knew of the existence of this ledger?" "Very few. My immediate superiors, naturally, and my aide-de-camp. But that was all classified material, sealed away after the war ended." He paused, frowning. "Though I suppose it's possible that some of our former associates might have learned of its existence over the years." Miss Marple settled into the chair across from his desk. "Tell me about these informants, Colonel. Were any of them left with unfulfilled promises of payment?" "Several, I'm afraid. The war ended abruptly in North Africa, and there wasn't always time to settle accounts properly. Some of those people disappeared into the chaos of the post-war period, and we never had the opportunity to locate them again." "And the code names, do you remember any of them?" Colonel Bantry was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the desk surface. "There was one in particular, Bluebird, a most valuable source of information about German supply routes. The agent was promised substantial compensation, but the records were lost in a bombing raid, and by the time we could investigate, the person had vanished entirely. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. Bluebird? How curious that you should mention a bird with blue in its name, considering the blue themes that seem to run through this entire affair. You think there might be a connection? In my experience, Colonel, coincidences are often more than they appear. Now, when did you last see this missing ledger? That's just it. I can't say for certain. I don't consult these wartime records regularly. It might have been missing for days or even weeks without my noticing. At that moment there was a soft knock at the study door, and Hugh Salt appeared, his political smile somewhat strained by the morning's events. I do apologise for interrupting, Colonel, but I wondered if I might have a word about last night's unfortunate incident. Of course, Salt. Please, come in. You know Miss Marple, I believe. Hugh Salt entered the room with the measured tread of a man accustomed to navigating delicate political situations. Indeed. Miss Marple, I hope you're finding your stay at Gosington Hall less eventful than you might have expected. On the contrary, Mr. Salt, Miss Marple replied with gentle irony. I find the events quite illuminating. Salt's expression became carefully neutral. I see. Well, I must say, this whole business has put us all in a rather awkward position. A dead stranger, mysterious circumstances. It's the sort of thing that could generate unfortunate publicity. Colonel Bantry's eyebrows rose slightly. Are you suggesting we should suppress information about what happened here? Not suppress exactly, Salt said carefully, but perhaps emphasise the more innocuous aspects of the situation. A vagrant seeking shelter from the storm, perhaps, who succumbed to natural causes. These things happen, and there's no need to create scandal where none exists. Miss Marple studied the young politician with growing interest. You seem very concerned about potential scandal, Mr. Salt. In my position, one must be careful about associations. A promising political career can be damaged by the most innocent connections if they're presented in the wrong light by one's opponents. I understand your concern, Colonel Bantry said slowly, but we can hardly ignore the evidence that suggests this was not a natural death. Salt's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. What evidence would that be? Miss Marple noted the slight edge in his voice. The footprints in the snow, for one thing, and Dr. Fenton's observations about the discoloration around the victim's lips. Circumstantial at best, Salt replied dismissively. Old Fenton's been retired for years. His medical opinions might not carry much weight with the authorities. Colonel Bantry leaned back in his chair, his military training evident in the way he assessed the younger man. Salt, is there something specific you're worried about? Some connection between yourself and last night's events? For a moment Hugh Salt's political composure slipped, revealing something that might have been genuine anxiety. Colonel, there are aspects of my past that could be misinterpreted if they came to light in connection with a mysterious death. Youthful indiscretions, you understand. Nothing criminal, but potentially embarrassing nonetheless. What sort of indiscretions? Miss Marple asked quietly. Salt hesitated, clearly weighing his words. During my university years, I was involved with a group that, well, let's say we were more interested in adventure than academics. We sometimes engaged in activities that were technically illegal, though harmless enough, sneaking into restricted areas, acquiring souvenirs from archaeological sites, that sort of thing. Smuggling? Colonel Bantry's voice was sharp. Nothing so dramatic, Salt said quickly, though I suppose some of our activities might be construed that way by unfriendly observers. The point is, any investigation into mysterious deaths or criminal activities could dredge up old stories that would be fatal to my political ambitions. Miss Marple watched his face carefully as he spoke. Mr. Salt, do you have any knowledge of orchid smuggling? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Orchid smuggling? What an odd thing to ask. Why would you— He stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. Has someone suggested that I am involved in such activities? I'm simply exploring all possibilities, Miss Marple replied mildly. The victim was found among Dr. Fenton's orchid collection, and there are suggestions that some rare specimens change hands through irregular channels. Salt's laugh sounded forced. "Miss Marple, I can assure you that my knowledge of orchids extends no further than admiring them at flower shows. If there's illegal activity involving rare plants, I know nothing about it." Colonel Bantry had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. "Salt, I think you should know that one of my wartime ledgers has gone missing. It contains sensitive information about intelligence operations and could be quite valuable to the wrong sort of person." The colour drained from Hugh Salt's face. "Missing? When did you discover this?" "This morning. The ledger for 1943 containing records of payments to informants. Some of those debts were never settled." Salt was quiet for a long moment, and Miss Marple could almost see his political mind calculating implications and possibilities. "Colonel," he said finally, "I think we need to consider the possibility that last night's victim was more than just a random vagrant. Someone with knowledge of classified wartime activities, perhaps, seeking to exploit old secrets." "You mean blackmail?" Colonel Bantry asked grimly. "It would explain a great deal," Salt replied, "and it would certainly provide a motive for murder." Miss Marple rose from her chair with thoughtful deliberation. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to examine Dr. Fenton's orchids more carefully. Something tells me that the connection between rare flowers, missing ledgers, and dead strangers is more significant than any of us have yet realised." As she left the study, she reflected on Hugh Salt's obvious anxiety about his past coming to light. Whether his concern was justified or simply the natural paranoia of an ambitious politician remained to be seen. But his reaction to questions about orchid smuggling had been particularly revealing. Chapter 7. The Portrait That Wouldn't Stay Silent. Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry in the morning room, standing before a large oil painting that dominated the wall between two tall windows. The portrait depicted a stern-faced gentleman in military dress uniform, his medals gleaming against a dark background. But something about the painting struck Miss Marple as oddly disturbing. "One of Arthur's ancestors," Dolly explained, noticing Miss Marple's interest. "General Sir Reginald Bantry, who served with distinction in the Crimean War. We had it rehung just last week after having it cleaned and reframed." Miss Marple approached the portrait more closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "A distinguished gentleman, to be sure, though I notice there seems to be some damage to the lower portion of the frame." "Yes, isn't it peculiar?" Dolly's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. "When James rehung it after the restoration, we discovered that someone had taken a knife to it. A small section at the bottom had been quite deliberately cut away, not damaged accidentally, but slashed with considerable force." "How very odd. When did you first notice this damage?" "Yesterday morning, when I was making final preparations for the evening's festivities. I wanted everything to look perfect, so I was checking each room carefully. The painting had been returned from the restorers only the day before, and I'm quite certain it was intact when it arrived." Miss Marple examined the damaged area more closely. The cut was indeed deliberate. A neat rectangular section, approximately 3 inches wide, had been removed from the bottom right corner of the canvas, just below the General's polished boots. "Mrs. Bantry, do you have any idea what might have been depicted in the missing section?" Dolly frowned thoughtfully. "I never paid particular attention to that part of the painting, I'm afraid. Family portraits all look rather similar after a while, don't they? Though I believe there might have been a small decorative element, perhaps a coat of arms or some symbolic device. Has the house been open to visitors recently? Anyone who might have had access to this room?" "Well, there have been the usual tradespeople, of course. The cleaning woman comes twice a week, and Dr. Fenton has been here several times recently to check on his orchids in the conservatory. Oh, and Veronica stopped by 2 days ago to discuss arrangements for the charity ball." Miss Marple made mental note of each visitor. "Dr. Fenton and Mrs. Denham. Did either of them spend time in this room?" "Veronica certainly did. We had tea here while discussing the evening's arrangements. As for Dr. Fenton, I believe he might have wandered through while I was showing him to the conservatory. He's always been interested in family history and antiques." At that moment James appeared in the doorway with his usual silent efficiency. "Mrs. Bantry, ma'am, Dr. Fenton is asking if he might examine his orchids again. He seems quite concerned about their condition after last night's events." "Of course, James, though please make certain he's accompanied. We mustn't disturb the scene unnecessarily." After the butler departed, Miss Marple continued her examination of the damaged portrait. Something about the precision of the cut suggested that whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. "Mrs. Bantry, I wonder if you might help me with something. Would it be possible to move this painting temporarily? I'd like to examine the wall behind it." Dolly looked puzzled but agreeable. "Certainly, though I can't imagine what you expect to find." Together they carefully lifted the heavy portrait from its hooks and leaned it against a nearby chair. The wall behind was papered in a faded floral pattern that had clearly been there for many years, but Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to a small discoloration near where the bottom of the frame had rested. "How interesting," she murmured, kneeling to examine the mark more closely. It appeared to be a stain of some sort, brownish in colour and roughly circular. "I've never noticed that before," Dolly said, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder, "though I suppose it's been hidden behind the painting for years." Miss Marple produced a small magnifying glass from her handbag, a tool she had found increasingly useful in her various investigations, and studied the stain with scientific precision. "Mrs. Bantry, this mark appears to be quite fresh. No more than a few days old, I should say. But how is that possible? The painting has been hanging there for—" Dolly stopped abruptly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Unless someone moved it deliberately. Precisely. Someone removed this painting, searched the wall behind it, and then rehung it, but not before cutting away whatever was depicted in that missing section. Miss Marple rose and examined the frame itself more carefully. Hidden in the decorative moulding along the bottom edge, she discovered something that made her pulse quicken with excitement. A few small fragments of what appeared to be dried flower petals, caught in the carved wooden scrollwork. "Mrs. Bantry, do you have a small pair of scissors and perhaps an envelope?" Dolly fetched the requested items from her writing desk, watching with fascination as Miss Marple carefully extracted the flower fragments and sealed them in the envelope. "Blue petals," Miss Marple observed with satisfaction, "and unless I'm very much mistaken, they belong to the same variety of orchid that was damaged in the conservatory." But what could that possibly mean? Before Miss Marple could answer, the door opened and Veronica Denham entered with her characteristic graceful composure. She was elegantly dressed in a wool suit of deep burgundy, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the unusual circumstances of the morning. "Dolly, darling, I hope you don't mind my intruding, but I was hoping we might discuss—" "Oh!" She stopped abruptly, taking in the displaced portrait and the two women kneeling beside the wall. "I seem to have interrupted something." "Not at all, Veronica," Dolly replied, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tension in her voice. "Miss Marple was helping me investigate some damage to the portrait." Veronica's eyes moved to the damaged painting, and Miss Marple was certain she detected a flicker of something. Recognition, alarm, in the other woman's expression. "How very odd," Veronica said carefully. "What sort of damage?" Miss Marple rose and showed her the cut section of canvas. "Someone removed this small portion quite deliberately. We were wondering if you might have any idea what was depicted there, since you're familiar with family portraits." Veronica studied the damage with apparent interest, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands, usually so gracefully still, were now clasped tightly together. "I'm afraid I never paid much attention to such details," Veronica said finally. "Family portraits all tend to look rather similar, don't they?" "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though I couldn't help but notice that you're wearing the same beautiful blue brooch this morning that you wore last evening. Such an unusual piece. A family heirloom, I believe you mentioned." Veronica's hand moved instinctively to the brooch at her throat, a gesture that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. "Yes, it belonged to my grandmother. I'm quite fond of it, actually. It must be very old to have such an antique setting. The workmanship looks distinctly Victorian." "Quite possibly. I'm afraid I've never had it properly appraised." Miss Marple smiled her gentle, knowing smile. "Perhaps you should consider doing so. Antique jewellery can often tell fascinating stories about the past, stories that their owners might not even suspect. As Veronica excused herself and left the room, Miss Marple reflected on the woman's obvious discomfort when questioned about the brooch. Combined with the blue orchid petals hidden in the portrait frame and the deliberate mutilation of the painting, a pattern was beginning to emerge that pointed to connections far more complex than a simple case of burglary gone wrong. Chapter 8. Tea on the terrace, with poison. By mid-afternoon, the winter sun had emerged from behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds of Gosington Hall. The temperature had risen sufficiently to make the glass loggia a pleasant refuge, its south-facing windows trapping the weak warmth and creating a comfortable space, despite the frigid conditions outside. Miss Marple had spent the early part of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, reviewing the various pieces of evidence she'd collected. The blue orchid petals, the missing ledger, the damaged portrait, and Veronica Denham's nervous reaction to questions about her brooch all pointed toward connections that were becoming increasingly significant. But it was time, she decided, to move from observation to more active investigation. "Mrs. Bantry," she said, finding Dolly in the morning room, "I wonder if you might help me with a small experiment." "Of course, Jane. What did you have in mind?" "I should like to invite all your guests to join us for afternoon tea in the loggia. Nothing formal, simply a gathering where we might all discuss last night's events in a more relaxed atmosphere." Dolly looked doubtful. "I'm not sure anyone is feeling particularly relaxed about the situation, but I suppose it might help to clear the air. Shall I ask James to prepare tea?" "Actually, I was hoping I might assist with the preparations. There are certain observations I should like to make about how people react to different circumstances." Within the hour, the loggia had been arranged with comfortable chairs around a low table, and James had provided everything necessary for a proper afternoon tea. Miss Marple had taken particular care with the preparation, selecting 2 identical teapots from the kitchen and making one small but significant modification to her plans. The guests assembled with the sort of polite reluctance that characterised people thrown together by unusual circumstances. Dr. Fenton arrived first, his wild white hair somewhat more dishevelled than usual, followed by Major Hale, who maintained his military bearing despite the obvious strain of the situation. Hugh Salt appeared with Elsie Ridge trailing in his wake, the young secretary carrying her inevitable notebook, and looking more nervous than ever. Veronica Denham was the last to arrive, her elegant composure intact but her eyes watchful. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," she said, settling gracefully into her chair. "Though I must confess, I find it difficult to concentrate on social pleasantries with that poor man's death weighing on all our minds." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied, beginning to pour tea from the first pot, "though sometimes discussion of difficult matters can help clarify our thoughts." She had prepared the tea service with meticulous care, using a harmless vegetable dye to tint the contents of one teapot a very pale blue, so faint as to be barely noticeable, unless one was specifically looking for it. The other pot contained perfectly normal tea. "Dr. Fenton," she said, offering him a cup from the tinted pot, "I understand you're quite knowledgeable about botanical matters. Have you given any thought to what might have caused the discoloration we observed around the victim's lips?" Dr. Fenton accepted the cup and sipped thoughtfully. "Most unusual, that discoloration. In my medical experience it suggests some form of toxin, though I couldn't say what without proper analysis." "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, noting that he showed no reaction to the faint blue tinge of his tea. "Major Hale, would you care for some tea?" "Most kind," the Major replied, accepting a cup from the normal pot. "Can't say I know much about poisons and such things, but that fellow certainly didn't look like he'd died naturally." Miss Marple continued serving, offering Hugh Salt tea from the untinted pot while providing Elsie Ridge with a cup from the pale blue batch. The young secretary accepted it gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. "Mr. Salt," Miss Marple said conversationally, "as a man of the world, I imagine you've encountered various unsavoury characters in your political career. Do you think our mysterious visitor might have been involved in blackmail?" Salt shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's certainly possible, There are always people willing to exploit others' secrets for financial gain. When Miss Marple turned to offer tea to Veronica Denham, she made certain to pour from the tinted pot, watching carefully for any reaction. Veronica reached for the cup with her usual graceful composure, but as she raised it toward her lips, Miss Marple observed something that confirmed her growing suspicions. The other woman paused almost imperceptibly, her eyes focusing on the pale liquid in her cup. Then, with movements so subtle that anyone not watching specifically for them would have missed the gesture entirely, Veronica set the cup down without drinking. "How careless of me," Veronica said with a light laugh. "I've just remembered that I had tea not an hour ago. Perhaps later." Miss Marple noted this reaction with quiet satisfaction while maintaining her pleasant demeanour. "Of course, my dear, one mustn't overindulge in caffeine." Colonel Bantry joined them at that moment, accepting a cup from the normal pot and settling into his chair with evident weariness. "Any progress in understanding last night's events?" "Some interesting observations," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Dr. Fenton, I'm curious about your orchid collection. Are there varieties that might be considered dangerous?" The elderly physician set down his cup and adjusted his spectacles. "Dangerous? Well, some orchids do contain compounds that could be harmful if ingested, though they're not typically thought of as poisonous plants." "What about the blue varieties specifically?" Dr. Fenton's expression became more serious. "Ah, now that's interesting. There are certain blue orchids, quite rare actually, that contain alkaloids with rather unusual properties. In the right concentration, they could certainly cause the sort of symptoms we observed." "And these blue orchids," Miss Marple continued, "would they be the sort that might interest collectors willing to pay high prices?" "Absolutely. Some of the rarer blue varieties command enormous sums on the international market." Veronica, who'd been listening to this exchange with apparent calm, suddenly spoke up. "Dr. Fenton, surely you're not suggesting that someone might have used your orchids to poison that poor man?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Dr. Fenton replied firmly. "I'm simply explaining the botanical facts." Miss Marple observed that Veronica's hands, usually so gracefully still, were now fidgeting with her blue cameo brooch. "Mrs. Denham, you seem quite knowledgeable about valuable objects. Have you ever encountered rare orchids in your travels?" "I wouldn't know a rare orchid from a common daisy," Veronica replied with what seemed like forced lightness. "My interests run more toward conventional antiques." "Such as that lovely brooch you're wearing? The craftsmanship is quite distinctive." Veronica's hand moved instinctively to cover the brooch. "As I mentioned, it was my grandmother's. Nothing particularly valuable, I'm sure." Miss Marple smiled her gentle, knowing smile. "Family heirlooms often have the most interesting histories, don't they? Sometimes they can tell us things about the past that we never suspected." As the afternoon wore on and the gathering gradually dispersed, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. Veronica Denham's refusal to drink the tinted tea, combined with her obvious recognition of the blue coloration, suggested knowledge that went far beyond casual familiarity with botanical poisons. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but Miss Marple knew that proving her suspicions would require more than circumstantial evidence and careful observation. She would need to uncover the connections between the missing ledger, the mysterious bluebird, and the elegant woman who wore a blue cameo brooch with such obvious anxiety. The truth, she suspected, lay in the past, in wartime secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. Chapter 9. Midnight by the Lake Pavilion. Miss Marple had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served her well during her various investigations into matters that others might consider beyond the scope of a village spinster. On this particular night, with snow still falling softly beyond her bedroom window, and the household supposedly settled into uneasy rest, she found sleep particularly elusive. It was perhaps 11:30 when she heard the soft creak of floorboards in the corridor outside her room. The sound was barely audible, the sort of noise that might be dismissed as the natural settling of an old house, but Miss Marple's experienced ear detected the deliberate rhythm of someone moving with careful stealth. She rose quietly from her bed and moved to the window, which provided a view of the grounds toward the ornamental lake that lay some 100 yards from the main house. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape and illuminating the small pavilion that stood at the lake's edge, a decorative folly built by some Victorian ancestor with romantic inclinations. As she watched, a figure emerged from the house below and began making its way across the lawn toward the lake. The person moved with evident familiarity with the terrain, following a path that would be invisible under the snow but which clearly existed in their memory. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her warmest dressing gown and quietly left her room. She had learned over the years that the most revealing conversations often took place when people believed themselves to be unobserved, and her instincts told her that tonight's clandestine meeting might provide the final pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling. The servants' staircase provided the most discreet route to the ground floor, and Miss Marple made her way down with the silent efficiency of someone who had navigated strange houses in the dark before. A heavy cloak hanging in the boot room served to protect her from the bitter cold as she slipped outside. The snow crunched softly underfoot as she followed the tracks left by the earlier figure, keeping to the shadows cast by the shrubbery that bordered the formal gardens. The pavilion stood silhouetted against the moonlit lake, its classical columns and domed roof creating an incongruously romantic scene for what Miss Marple suspected would be a decidedly unromantic encounter. As she drew closer, voices became audible from within the pavilion. Two people engaged in what sounded like an urgent, whispered conversation. Miss Marple positioned herself behind a convenient rhododendron bush, close enough to observe and listen, but concealed from view. The first voice she recognised immediately as belonging to Elsie Ridge, Hugh Salt's nervous secretary. But there was nothing nervous about her tone now. Instead, she spoke with the firm authority of someone accustomed to making demands. "You promised me that ledger weeks ago, Mrs. Denham. My patience is wearing thin." "These things take time, Miss Ridge," came Veronica's cool response. "One cannot simply walk into someone's study and remove documents without arousing suspicion. Time is something we may not have much more of. That detective's presence has complicated everything." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose at this description of the dead stranger. So he had indeed been a detective, but working for whom and investigating what? "The detective is no longer a problem," Veronica said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Though his death has created complications of its own. You killed him." It was not a question but a statement, delivered in a tone that suggested Elsie Ridge was neither surprised nor particularly shocked by this revelation. "He left me no choice." The man was becoming increasingly threatening, demanding not only money, but the return of certain items that he claimed belonged to his client, such as the brooch, among other things. Apparently his employer had been tracking various artifacts that went missing during the war, and this particular piece was on their list. Miss Marple's mind raced as the implications of this conversation became clear. The blue cameo brooch was stolen property, taken during wartime, and now being tracked by someone seeking its recovery. "And the ledger," Elsie pressed. "I have it." Veronica's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Obtained it this afternoon while everyone was distracted by Miss Marple's little tea party. Though I must say, that woman's methods are rather unsettling." Elsie Ridge moved closer to Veronica, and Miss Marple could see both figures clearly in the moonlight streaming through the pavilion's open archways. The secretary was holding something in her hands, a leather-bound volume that could only be Colonel Bantry's missing wartime ledger. "Here are the records you wanted," Elsie said, handing over the book. "Every payment made to informants during the North African campaign, including the substantial sum promised to Bluebird but never delivered." Veronica accepted the ledger with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent! This should provide more than enough evidence to support your claim." "It had better. I've waited nearly 15 years to prove that my father was owed that money. Colonel Bantry and his friends thought they could simply forget about their obligations when the war ended, but the Ridges have long memories." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. Elsie Ridge was the daughter of the mysterious Bluebird, seeking proof that her father had been cheated of his promised compensation. The detective you hired was becoming unreliable, Veronica continued. Too greedy, too demanding. When he threatened to expose our arrangement unless I increased his payment, I realised he had to be eliminated. How did you manage it? Orchid poison, extracted from one of Dr. Fenton's prized blue specimens. Quite elegant, really. Tasteless, colourless, and virtually undetectable unless one knows what to look for. Elsie shuddered slightly. And the time of death? That was the clever part. I had him meet me in the conservatory at 9:30 while everyone was still at dinner. The poison acted quickly. He was dead within minutes. Then I used that broken wheelbarrow to transport the body back to the conservatory later, after manipulating his pocket watch to show 10:17. Why 10:17 specifically? Because that was when you were supposedly in the library typing letters for Mr. Salt. It provides you with a perfect alibi while implying that the murder occurred when I was visible to multiple witnesses in the drawing room. Miss Marple realised with growing alarm that she was witnessing a confession to murder, but also that both women were aware of far more than they had initially revealed. This was not a simple case of an amateur crime, but a carefully planned operation involving multiple conspirators. "What about Miss Marple?" Elsie asked. "She seems to be getting dangerously close to the truth." Veronica's laugh was cold and calculating. "Miss Marple may be observant, but she's also elderly and alone. If she becomes too much of a threat..." The implication hung in the frigid air like a threat, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She had heard enough to understand the scope of the conspiracy and the danger it represented, but she had also placed herself in considerable peril by witnessing this midnight meeting. As the two women began to conclude their business and prepare to return to the house, Miss Marple realised she needed to withdraw before they discovered her presence. But as she began to move away from her hiding place, her foot caught on a concealed root, and she stumbled slightly. The small sound was enough to alert the conspirators to her presence. "What was that?" Elsie whispered sharply. "Someone's there," Veronica replied, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Miss Marple, I presume? You really shouldn't eavesdrop on private conversations." Miss Marple straightened with as much dignity as she could muster under the circumstances. "Good evening, ladies. I was merely taking some air before retiring." At midnight? In a snowstorm? Veronica's tone was sceptical and threatening. "I think not, Miss Marple. I think you've heard rather more than was intended for your ears." Chapter 10. Revelation in the Winter Garden. The confrontation at the Lake Pavilion might have ended very differently had not the sound of approaching voices reached them across the snow-covered grounds. Dolly Bantry's distinctive tones, raised in concern, carried clearly through the still night air. Jane, are you out there? We saw tracks in the snow from your window." "It seems," Miss Marple observed with considerable relief, "that my absence has been noted. How fortunate." Veronica Denham's expression hardened with frustration, but Elsie Ridge grasped her arm urgently. "We can't do anything now. Too many witnesses." "This isn't over, Miss Marple," Veronica said in a low voice that carried unmistakable menace. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied with serene composure, "I believe it very nearly is." The rescue party that emerged from the house consisted of Colonel Bantry, Dolly and Major Hale, all wrapped in heavy coats and carrying lanterns. Dr. Fenton followed close behind, his wild white hair visible even in the dim light. "Thank heavens we found you," Dolly exclaimed as they reached the pavilion. "When we discovered you'd gone out in this weather, we feared the worst." "Most thoughtful of you," Miss Marple replied, noting how Veronica and Elsie had positioned themselves to appear as if they too had been part of the search party. "I couldn't sleep and thought some fresh air might help, but I'm afraid I became rather turned around in the snow." Colonel Bantry's military eye took in the scene with practised assessment. "Strange that you should all end up at the pavilion. Quite a coincidence." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed meaningfully, "though I've found that coincidences often reveal themselves to be something quite different upon closer examination." As they made their way back to the house, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Dr. Fenton, who seemed unusually agitated despite the successful conclusion of their midnight expedition. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, There's something I must tell you about my orchids." "Yes, Dr. Fenton. I've been examining them more carefully since yesterday's events, and I've discovered that someone has been systematically harvesting certain specimens. Not just the blue camellia that was damaged, but several others, always the rarest varieties, and always in quantities that would be sufficient for extracting concentrated essences." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing certainty about the identity of the culprit. "Have you mentioned this to anyone else?" "Not yet. I wasn't entirely certain until this evening, when I found fresh evidence of tampering. I think, Dr. Fenton, that we should gather everyone together in the morning for a complete discussion of these matters. There are revelations that must be made." Dawn broke clear and cold over Gosington Hall, the storm having finally exhausted itself during the night. Miss Marple rose early and made her preparations with the methodical thoroughness that characterised all her undertakings. By 8 o'clock she had requested that all the guests and household members assemble in the conservatory, the scene of the original crime. The gathering that convened among Dr. Fenton's exotic plants was a subdued one. The events of the previous evening had strained everyone's nerves, and the bright morning light streaming through the glass walls seemed to emphasise rather than dispel the shadows that hung over the company. Miss Marple positioned herself near the spot where the body had been discovered, the damaged orchids providing a dramatic backdrop for what she knew would be her final revelations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began in her clear, gentle voice, "we have been brought together by tragic circumstances, but I believe the time has come to reveal the truth about what happened here 2 nights ago." She paused, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face, noting the varying degrees of tension and anxiety displayed by her audience. The man who died in this conservatory was indeed a private detective, hired by Miss Elsie Ridge to investigate a wartime injustice. Her father, you see, was the informant known as Bluebird, who provided valuable intelligence to British forces in North Africa, but was never paid the substantial compensation he had been promised. Elsie Ridge's face went white, but she remained silent as Miss Marple continued. Miss Ridge had spent years trying to prove her father's service and claim the money owed to his estate. She eventually discovered that Colonel Bantry possessed the ledger containing the relevant records, and she took employment with Mr. Salt specifically to gain access to this house. Colonel Bantry looked thunderstruck. "My dear Miss Marple, are you suggesting that Miss Ridge—" "Please, Colonel, allow me to finish. Miss Ridge did indeed hire the detective to help establish her claim, but she was not working alone. She had formed an alliance with Mrs. Veronica Denham, who had her own reasons for wanting to examine that ledger." All eyes turned to Veronica, who maintained her elegant composure despite the growing tension in the room. Mrs. Denham, you see, was not simply interested in supporting Miss Ridge's quest for justice. During her own wartime service, for you did serve, didn't you, Mrs. Denham, though not in any official capacity, you acquired certain valuable items through irregular channels, items that included the blue cameo brooch you've been wearing. Veronica's hand moved instinctively to her throat where the brooch gleamed against her dark clothing. The detective had been hired initially to help Miss Ridge, but his investigations had uncovered other matters as well. He had traced several valuable artifacts stolen during the war, including your brooch, Mrs. Denham. When he realised what he had discovered, he began making additional demands, not just for payment, but for the return of stolen property. Hugh Salt, who had been listening with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that Mrs. Denham—" "I'm suggesting, Mr. Salt, that Mrs. Denham found herself in an impossible position. She could not return the brooch without exposing her wartime activities, but she could not satisfy the detective's demands without risking her reputation and her forthcoming marriage to you." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Miss Marple continued with relentless logic. The solution she chose was murder, using poison extracted from Dr. Fenton's rare blue orchids, knowledge she had acquired through careful study of botanical toxicology. She arranged to meet the detective in this conservatory during dinner on the night of the charity ball. Dr. Fenton nodded grimly. "The blue orchid varieties I mentioned. In concentrated form, they would indeed cause the symptoms we observed." The murder itself was carefully timed, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Denham killed the detective at 9:30, then manipulated his pocket watch to show 10:17, creating a false timeline that would provide alibis for herself and Miss Ridge. She then used the broken wheelbarrow to transport the body back to this location, erasing the footprints in a manner that suggested the victim had never left the conservatory. Veronica Denham had listened to this exposition with growing pallor, but now she straightened with defiant dignity. "You have no proof of these allegations, Miss Marple. This is all speculation and conjecture." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied calmly, producing the envelope containing the blue orchid petals she had discovered in the portrait frame. "I have physical evidence linking you to the poison, testimony from the household staff about the detective's interest in your brooch, and most importantly, I have the stolen ledger." She gestured toward Colonel Bantry, who stepped forward with the leather-bound volume. "You see, Mrs. Denham, when you retrieved this ledger from Colonel Bantry's study yesterday, you made one crucial error. You assumed that no one would notice its absence until much later, but Colonel Bantry discovered the theft almost immediately, and we have been watching for its return ever since." Veronica's composure finally cracked. He was going to ruin everything. Years of careful planning, a new life, a respectable marriage, all destroyed by one greedy detective who couldn't be satisfied with the reasonable payment. The confession, delivered with passionate intensity, sealed her fate. As Colonel Bantry moved to detain her and Major Hale went to summon the authorities, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of wartime secrets and long-delayed justice that had led to tragedy at Gosington Hall. Elsie Ridge, her own scheme exposed but her role as accomplice rather than murderer, likely to result in more lenient treatment, sat quietly weeping for the father whose memory she had tried to honour and the detective whose death now stained her efforts. As the snow began to melt in the strengthening sun, Miss Marple knew that while justice would be served, the scars left by wartime betrayals and the desperate measures taken to conceal them would linger long after the immediate crisis had passed. "Well, Dolly," she said to her friend as the authorities led Veronica Denham away, "I believe your next charity event will indeed be considerably more peaceful." Dolly Bantry managed a wan smile. "Seed catalogues and sponge cake, Jane. Nothing more adventurous than that." Miss Marple's gentle, knowing smile suggested that she understood perfectly the appeal of such simple, innocent pleasures after the revelations of the past few days,